A
look
flight
at this. They can't
attendant
just ignore what
insulted his
happened.
mother.
I
This little
understand your
black
concern,
boy's
but I
response
need you to
changed
calm down and
everything.
return to your seat.
She said it loud enough for everyone to hear. The words hung in the air like poison, cutting to the hum of the airplane cabin, slicing into the heart of a woman who had done nothing wrong except exist in a space where someone decided she didn't belong. And in that moment, an 8-year-old boy made a decision that would expose years of hidden cruelty, shatter careers, and force an entire airline to confront a truth they'd been burying for far too long. What happened next didn't involve yelling. It didn't involve tears. It involved something far more powerful. Because when dignity is attacked, sometimes the quietest response becomes the loudest revolution. His name was Elijah Montgomery. And this is the story of how one child's courage changed everything. Elijah was 8 years old, but his eyes carried the kind of awareness that made adults uncomfortable. Not because he was disrespectful. He was one of the most polite children you'd ever meet. But because he saw things. He noticed patterns. He remembered details that others dismissed or forgot. He was small for his age, with deep brown skin, close-cropped hair, and a face that rarely smiled in public, but lit up entirely when he was alone with his mother. He had a habit of tilting his head slightly when he listened, as if he were recording every word, every tone, every shift in energy. And, in a way, Elijah carried a small blue notebook everywhere. Always. His mother had given it to him for his 7th birthday, and he'd filled half of it already with observations about the world. Not childish drawings or simple lists, but thoughts, questions, things that didn't make sense to him, things he wanted to understand. His mother, Sarah Montgomery, was the center of his universe. Sarah was 32 years old, a registered nurse who worked the night shift at County General Hospital. She had warm brown eyes that crinkled when she laughed, natural hair she wore in twists when she had the energy to maintain them, and pulled back in a simple bun when she didn't, and hands that were always slightly cold from washing them dozens of times per shift. She was beautiful in the way that exhausted people are beautiful, carrying grace even when bone-tired, offering kindness even when running on empty. Sarah had raised Elijah alone since he was 2, after his father decided fatherhood wasn't for him, and disappeared into a life that didn't include responsibility. She never spoke badly about him to Elijah. She simply poured everything she had into making sure her son knew he was loved, valued, and capable of anything. Every night, no matter how late her shift ran, Sarah read to Elijah before bed. Sometimes it was only a few pages before exhaustion pulled her under, but she never missed a night. She read him everything: adventure stories, biographies, science books, poetry. She believed that words were power, and she wanted Elijah to have an arsenal. She taught him other things, too. "Baby," she'd say, sitting beside him at their small kitchen table while she reviewed patient charts. "When you see something that isn't right, you pay attention. You document. You remember, because the truth matters, and sometimes you're the only one who'll stand up for it." Sarah had learned this the hard way. Years of being overlooked, underestimated, spoken over in hospital meetings despite having more experience than the people dismissing her. Years of watching patients of color receive different treatment, different levels of care, different assumptions about their pain tolerance and their honesty. She documented everything, filed reports, advocated quietly but persistently. And she taught Elijah to do the same, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Their life wasn't easy. Sarah worked doubles regularly, picking up extra shifts to keep them afloat. Their apartment was small, in a neighborhood where sirens were the nighttime lullaby, but it was clean and filled with books and love. Elijah wore thrift store clothes that Sarah washed and ironed until they looked almost new. They ate simply: beans and rice, pasta, vegetables she stretched across multiple meals. But they were happy. They had each other, and that was everything. 3 weeks before the flight, Sarah received the call she'd been dreading. Her mother, Elijah's grandmother, Dorothy, had suffered a stroke. She was stable but weak, and the doctors weren't sure how much time she had left. Dorothy lived across the country, in the small Georgia town where Sarah had grown up, and Sarah hadn't seen her in 2 years because she couldn't afford the trip. But now there was no choice. Sarah checked her savings account and felt her stomach drop. She'd been building it slowly, $5 here, $10 there, hoping to eventually take Elijah somewhere special. The balance was just barely enough for 2 economy tickets if she booked immediately and didn't eat for the next month. She booked them that night. When she told Elijah they were going to see Grandma Dorothy, his face lit up. He'd only met his grandmother a handful of times, but he remembered her voice on the phone, warm and deep, calling him my brilliant boy, and asking him questions about school like his answers were the most important things in the world. "We're flying," Elijah asked, eyes wide. "We're flying," Sarah confirmed, pulling him close. Elijah had never been on a plane before. He'd watched them overhead countless times, tracing their paths across the sky, wondering what it felt like to be up there among the clouds. He'd read books about aviation, about how planes stayed in the air, about the physics of flight. Now he'd finally experience it. For the next 3 weeks, Elijah read everything he could find about airplanes. He learned about different aircraft models, about flight attendants and pilots, about safety procedures and airline policies. Sarah watched him absorb information the way other kids absorb cartoons, and her heart swelled with pride and ached with worry in equal measure. She worried because she knew what the world could be like for a black boy, even one as smart and kind as Elijah. She'd seen it already. Teachers who assumed he was disruptive before he'd said a word, store clerks who followed him through aisles, parents who pulled their children away at playgrounds. She'd worked so hard to build armor around his heart without hardening it, to teach him awareness without stealing his innocence. The night before their flight, Sarah sat on the edge of Elijah's bed while he packed his small backpack with meticulous care. His notebook, 2 books, a pencil case, a small bag of crackers Sarah had set aside for him. "Mama," he said softly, not looking up from his organizing, "are you scared about Grandma?" Sarah's throat tightened. "A little bit, baby, but I'm grateful we get to see her." "Me too." He zipped the backpack carefully. "I'm going to tell her about everything, about school and my books, and the new route we take to the library. She'll love that." Elijah finally looked up at her, those observant eyes studying her face. "Are you okay?" Sarah managed a smile. "I'm okay, sweetheart. I'm tired, but I'm okay." "You're always tired," Elijah said matter-of-factly. "You work too hard. That's what mamas do. When I grow up, I'm going to take care of you, so you can rest." Sarah pulled him into her arms, burying her face in his hair, breathing him in. "You already take care of me, Elijah, every single day." The morning of the flight, they woke before dawn. Sarah moved through their apartment on autopilot, coffee, toast, double-checking tickets and identification, making sure everything was locked up properly. She'd worked a shift the night before, sleeping only 2 hours before her alarm went off, and exhaustion sat heavy in her bones. But she pushed through. She always did. They took 2 buses to reach the airport. Elijah pressed against the window, watching the city wake up, his notebook open on his lap. He was drawing the skyline, adding small notes about the buildings they passed. Inside the airport, Elijah's wonder was palpable. He stared up at the departure boards, at the crowds of people moving with purpose, at the massive windows showing planes lined up on the tarmac. Sarah watched him drink it all in, and for a moment, her exhaustion lifted. This was worth it. Seeing that light in his eyes was worth everything. They checked their bags, 1 small suitcase between them, and moved through security. Elijah followed every instruction perfectly, placing his backpack in the bin, walking to the scanner, waiting patiently while Sarah gathered their belongings on the other side. Their gate was far down the terminal. By the time they reached it, Sarah's feet ached and her head throbbed with the beginning of a headache. She sank into a seat while Elijah stood at the window, watching planes taxi and take off. "That's a Boeing 737, he said, pointing. "And that one's an Airbus A320. An older white woman sitting nearby smiled at him. "You know your planes, young man." "I like to read about them," Elijah replied politely. The woman's smile widened. "What a bright boy." Sarah felt a familiar mix of pride and wariness. She knew that compliments for black children often came with surprise attached, an unspoken "despite what I expected" hanging in the air. But Elijah simply thanked the woman and returned to his plane watching unbothered. When boarding was called, they lined up with the other economy passengers. Sarah held their boarding passes in one hand and Elijah's hand in the other. She felt him squeeze her fingers gently, his way of saying, "I'm here, Mama." They moved down the jetway, and then they were inside the plane. The space felt smaller than Elijah had imagined, more compressed, the ceiling lower. Flight attendants stood near the front, greeting passengers with practiced smiles. Sarah guided Elijah down the aisle, checking seat numbers, moving past business class with its wider seats and extra legroom, back into economy where the seats pressed together and the overhead bins were already filling up. Their seats were in row 32, second to last row on the plane, window and middle seat. Sarah let Elijah take the window, knowing how much it would mean to him. As they settled in, Sarah tried to lift their small carry-on bag into the overhead compartment. Her arms trembled with fatigue, and the bag was heavier than she'd remembered. "Here, let me help you with that." Sarah turned to see a flight attendant approaching. She was white mid-30s, with blonde hair pulled back in a sleek bun, makeup perfect, uniform crisp. Her name tag read Monica. "Thank you," Sarah said, grateful. Monica took the bag, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She hoisted it up with efficient movements, closed the bin, and walked away without another word. Sarah didn't think much of it. Flight attendants were busy. She understood. She helped Elijah buckle his seatbelt, showed him how to adjust it, pointed out the safety card in the seat pocket. Elijah studied everything with intense focus, reading every word on the card, examining the diagrams. The plane filled around them. A white couple took the seats across the aisle, unpacking tablets and headphones. A businessman settled in front of them, already on his laptop. The cabin hummed with movement and conversation. Sarah's eyes felt heavy. She'd taken a pain reliever for her headache, but it hadn't kicked in yet. She closed her eyes briefly, just for a moment of rest. "Mama, look." Elijah tugged her sleeve gently. She opened her eyes to see him pointing out the window at the luggage carts below, at the ground crew moving with choreographed efficiency. "They have to load everything perfectly," Elijah explained, "for weight distribution. Otherwise, the plane won't fly right." "You're teaching me things I never knew," Sarah said softly. "That's what we do," Elijah replied with complete seriousness. "We teach each other." Sarah's heart clenched. 8 years old, and already so wise. The cabin door closed. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard, announcing the flight time, 4 hours and 32 minutes. Flight attendants began moving through the aisles, checking seat belts, securing overhead bins. Monica passed by their row, her eyes sliding over Sarah and Elijah without acknowledgement. The plane pushed back from the gate, and Elijah pressed his face to the window, watching everything. Sarah let herself lean back, let her eyes close again, just for the taxi to the runway. The engines roared to life. The plane accelerated faster and faster, and then lift. Elijah gasped softly as the ground fell away beneath them. Sarah opened her eyes to see his face transformed with wonder, watching the airport grow small. The city spread out below them like a map. "We're flying," he whispered. "Mama, we're actually flying." "We are, baby." She squeezed his hand. For a few minutes, everything was perfect. The seatbelt sign dinged off. People began moving around the cabin, pulling out books and tablets, adjusting their seats. Flight attendants emerged with the beverage cart. Elijah watched them work, noting how they poured drinks, how they spoke to passengers, cataloging everything in that careful way of his. The cart reached their row. A younger flight attendant, her name tag reading Jessica, smiled at them warmly. "What can I get for you?" "Just water, please," Sarah said. "And for you, sweetheart?" Jessica looked at Elijah. "Do you have apple juice?" Elijah asked politely. "We sure do." Jessica poured them both drinks, handed them over with napkins, and moved on. Elijah sipped the juice carefully, making it last. Sarah drank her water and felt her headache finally beginning to ease. 30 minutes into flight, Elijah needed to use the bathroom. Sarah unclipped both their seat belts and guided him toward the back of the plane, past the last row to the tiny lavatory. She waited outside while he went in, her hand resting against the wall for balance as the plane hit a small patch of turbulence. When Elijah emerged, Monica was standing near the galley at the very back, preparing something on the counter. She glanced up at them, and Sarah saw something in her expression shift. A tightening around the eyes, a slight curl at the corner of her mouth. "Everything all right?" Monica asked, but the warmth Jessica had shown was completely absent. "Yes, thank you," Sarah replied, guiding Elijah back toward their seats. She felt Monica's eyes following them down the aisle. An hour passed. The flight attendants came through again, this time offering snacks. Sarah and Elijah each received a small package of crackers. Elijah ate his slowly, reading his book between bites. Sarah tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. She was too aware of the recycled air, the engine noise, the proximity of strangers. Elijah tugged on her sleeve again. "Mama, I'm cold." The cabin was chilly. They always kept planes cold, Sarah knew, and Elijah was wearing only a thin long-sleeve shirt. She'd packed a jacket in their checked bag, not thinking he'd need it on the plane. Sarah pressed the call button above their seats. Minutes passed. No one came. She pressed it again. Monica finally appeared, her expression neutral, but somehow conveying annoyance. "Yes." "I'm sorry to bother you," Sarah said, keeping her voice polite, "but my son is cold. Do you have any extra blankets?" Monica's eyes flicked to Elijah, then back to Sarah. "We don't have any blankets left. They were distributed during boarding to first class." "Oh." Sarah felt foolish for asking. "That's okay. Thank you." Monica didn't move. She stood there for a moment, looking at them with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. Then she said, "If you'd wanted a blanket, you should have requested one earlier." The words landed like a slap. Sarah blinked. I didn't know. We've never flown before." "Well, now you know." Monica's smile was tight, cold. "In the future, perhaps you should fly on an airline more suited to your budget." The implication hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable. Sarah's face burned. She felt every passenger in the nearby rows go quiet, felt their attention shift toward this moment. She wanted to respond, wanted to defend herself, wanted to say that she'd paid for these tickets just like everyone else, that they had every right to be here. But the word stuck in her throat, because she'd had this experience before, too many times before. The subtle implications, the coded language, the way people could make you feel small without saying anything explicitly wrong. And she knew that if she pushed back, she'd be labeled as difficult, aggressive, causing a scene. So instead, she said quietly, "I understand. Thank you." Monica walked away. Sarah sat frozen, shame and anger warring inside her chest. She felt Elijah beside her, felt his small body tense with awareness. When she finally looked at him, his eyes were on her face, searching. "I'm okay," she whispered, though they both knew it was a lie. Elijah didn't say anything. He simply reached over and took her hand, lacing his small fingers through hers. Then he did something Sarah didn't immediately notice. He reached into his backpack and pulled out his blue notebook, and he began to write. He wrote the date, the time, flight number 2847, seat 32A. He wrote Monica's name from her name tag. He wrote exactly what she'd said, word for word. His memory was precise, trained by years of listening to his mother's patient reports, by reading and rereading books until he could recite passages. He wrote, "Flight attendant Monica told my mother we should fly on an airline more suited to our budget after my mother asked for a blanket because I was cold." He wrote, "She said this loud enough for other passengers to hear." He wrote, "My mother said, 'Thank you,' even though she did nothing wrong." Sarah, lost in her own humiliation, didn't see what he was doing, but the man across the aisle did. His name was David Chun. He was 72 years old, a retired civil rights attorney, traveling home from visiting his daughter. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, gray hair, and hands marked with age spots that had signed countless legal documents in their time. David had watched the entire interaction, had seen Monica's coldness, heard her cutting words, witnessed Sarah's quiet acceptance of disrespect she didn't deserve. And now he watched an 8-year-old boy document it all with the careful precision of someone much older. David caught Elijah's eye. The boy looked up, met his gaze across the aisle. David gave him a small nod, not of pity, but of recognition, of respect. Elijah nodded back and returned to his writing. Sarah finally noticed the notebook. "Baby, what are you doing?" "Documenting." Elijah said simply, "Documenting what?" "What happened?" "What she said." He looked up at his mother. "You taught me to document things that aren't right, so I'm documenting." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She pulled him close, pressed her lips to the top of his head. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," Elijah said firmly. "Because she was wrong, Mama, and you were right, and someone should know that." Sarah held him tighter, overwhelmed by love and sadness and fierce pride all tangled together. The flight continued. An hour later, meal service began. The flight attendants moved to the cabin with carts full of small trays. Nothing fancy, just a standard chicken or pasta option that came with economy tickets. When the cart reached their row, it was Monica again. She handed meals to the couple across the aisle without a word, her smile polite and empty. She gave a tray to the businessman in front of them, asked if he needed anything else, offered him an extra bread roll. Then she reached Sarah and Elijah's row and stopped. "Chicken or pasta?" she asked flatly, not looking at them. "Chicken, please," Sarah said. "Both of us." Monica placed one tray on Sarah's lap. Then she moved to the next row. Sarah stared down at the single tray. "Excuse me? We need 2 meals. For both of us." Monica turned back, eyebrows raised. "I only have enough for 1 per row in this section. Catering shortage." "But you just gave 2 meals to—" "I said what I said." Monica's voice cut through Sarah's protest. "If you have a problem, you can file a complaint after we land." She pushed the cart forward, leaving Sarah sitting there with 1 meal and a son who'd watched his mother be dismissed again. David Chin leaned across the aisle. "Miss," he called to Monica. She stopped, turned. Her tone changed immediately, became warmer. "Yes, sir? How can I help you?" "That young man didn't receive his meal," David said, pointing to Elijah. "As I explained, we have a catering shortage. You had enough for my row. You had enough for every row I've observed. I'd like to understand why this particular row is the one facing a shortage." Monica's smile became strained. "Sir, I don't appreciate your implication." "I'm not implying anything. I'm observing a discrepancy and asking for clarification." Other passengers were watching now, some with phones out, some simply listening. Monica's face flushed. "Fine, I'll see what I can find." She returned 5 minutes later with another tray, slapped it onto Elijah's tray table without a word, and walked away. Sarah's hands shook as she opened the meals. She couldn't eat. Her stomach was in knots, humiliation and anger stealing her appetite. But she opened Elijah's meal carefully, made sure he had utensils, encouraged him to eat. Elijah ate mechanically, his eyes distant. Then he wiped his hands, pulled out his notebook again, and added to his documentation. "Meal service. Flight attendant Monica initially refused to provide a meal for me, claimed catering shortage, but other rows received full service. Only brought meal after passenger in 32C, Mr. Chun, intervened." He noted the time. He added details about how Monica's tone changed when speaking to Mr. Chun versus speaking to his mother. Sarah watched him write and felt something shift inside her. Not resignation, not acceptance, but a spark of something fiercer. Her son, her 8-year-old baby, was refusing to let this disappear into silence. Maybe she should too. "Elijah," she said softly. He looked up. "You're right to document this. Thank you for being brave when I couldn't be. You're always brave, Mama. You just carry it different." Sarah's breath caught. 8 years old, she thought again. How is he only 8 years old? The flight wore on. Sarah's exhaustion deepened, but sleep still wouldn't come. Elijah alternated between looking out the window and reading his book and adding observations to his notebook. He noticed things Sarah didn't. He noticed that when Monica walked through the cabin, she smiled at white passengers and nodded at Asian passengers and made eye contact with everyone except the black passengers scattered throughout the plane. He noticed that she'd asked the white couple across the aisle if they needed anything extra 3 separate times, but hadn't returned to check on Sarah and Elijah once. He noticed that when a black man 6 rows up pressed the call button, Monica took 7 minutes to respond. But when a white woman 2 rows behind him pressed hers, Monica appeared within 90 seconds. Elijah wrote it all down, not with anger, not with hatred, but with clarity, because his mother had taught him that truth was a form of power, and documentation was how you protected truth from being denied. 3 hours into flight, Elijah heard something that changed everything. The call button near the bathroom chimed, and Monica walked past their row toward the back. She met another flight attendant near the galley, the kind one, Jessica, and they stood there talking in low voices. Elijah had sharp hearing, and the cabin noise, while present, wasn't enough to cover their conversation. "I don't understand why you're being so cold to that woman and her son," Jessica said, her voice tense. "They haven't done anything wrong." "I don't have to explain myself to you," Monica replied. "Actually, you kind of do. We're supposed to treat all passengers with respect. They're lucky to be on this flight at all. You know how many complaints we get about people who don't belong in these spaces." "Don't belong? Monica, what are you?" "Look, I've been doing this for 12 years. I know who causes problems and who doesn't. I've seen their type before. They act entitled. They make demands. They play the victim card when they don't get special treatment. She asked for a blanket. That's not a demand, that's a request. You're too new to understand. Trust me, it's better to establish boundaries early. Let them know they can't just expect the same level of service as everyone else." Elijah's pencil froze on the page. Jessica's voice dropped even lower. "You realize you're describing discrimination, right? Like textbook discrimination?" "Oh, please, don't be dramatic. I treat everyone fine. I just prioritize the passengers who actually matter. The business class flyers, the frequent flyers, the people who keep this airline running. Those economy passengers, they're a dime a dozen. If they don't like it, they can fly someone else. What about the other black passengers on this flight? You've ignored all of them. Keep your voice down." Monica's tone hardened. "And stop making this about race. It's about economics, about who deserves premium service. But you only apply that standard to certain passengers. Enough. I don't answer to you. I've got seniority, I've got a perfect record, and I've got management that backs me up, so drop it." Footsteps. Monica walking away. Elijah sat very still, his heart pounding. He looked down at his notebook and began writing faster. He documented the conversation word for word, capturing as much as his memory could hold. He noted Jessica's name, noted that she tried to intervene, noted that Monica had admitted to treating passengers differently based on her perception of who mattered. Sarah had dozed off, her head tilted against the window. Elijah didn't wake her. He just kept writing. Because this wasn't just about a blanket anymore. This wasn't just about one meal, one flight, one moment. This was about a pattern, a system, a belief structure that had been operating unchecked. And Elijah understood something most adults wouldn't give an 8-year-old credit for understanding. Individual cruelty was bad, but systemic cruelty was worse. Because systemic cruelty had rules, had precedent, had people who knew it was happening, and let it continue anyway. Monica had said she had management backing her up. That meant this had happened before. That meant other people had been hurt. That meant if no one spoke up, it would keep happening. Elijah thought about his grandmother, lying in a hospital bed across the country, weak from her stroke. He thought about how his mother worked herself to exhaustion caring for strangers. He thought about all the times he'd seen his mother accept disrespect with quiet dignity because fighting back felt too risky, too costly. And he made a decision. When this plane landed, he wasn't going to stay quiet. He was going to speak up, not for himself, not even just for his mother, but for everyone who'd ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. Another hour passed. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing their descent into Atlanta. The cabin stirred with movement as people gathered belongings, folded up tray tables, returned seats to upright positions. Sarah woke with start, disoriented. Elijah was reading his book, looking calm. "We're landing soon, Mama," he said quietly. She nodded, rubbing her face, tried to shake off the fog of exhausted sleep. The plane descended through clouds. Elijah watched out the window as the world came into focus below. Highways and buildings and the sprawl of Atlanta spreading out like a circuit board. The wheels touched down with a gentle bump. The engines roared in reverse. They were down. Sarah let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Around them, passengers unbuckled seatbelts prematurely, stood up while the plane was still taxiing, pulled down overhead bins in defiance of the lighted signs. Monica's voice came over the intercom, thanking them for flying and reminding them to remain seated until the plane came to a complete stop at the gate. Her voice was pleasant, professional, completely at odds with the woman Elijah had witnessed. The plane reached the gate. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Everyone stood at once, a mass of bodies pressing into the aisle, fighting for overhead space, eager to escape. Sarah and Elijah waited. They were in the back anyway. There was no point fighting the crowd. Slowly, the cabin emptied. Rows and rows of passengers filed out, hauling bags, checking phones, moving toward whatever came next. Sarah finally stood, retrieved their carry-on, helped Elijah into the aisle. "Come on, baby. Let's go see Grandma." They moved toward the front of the plane. Jessica stood near the exit, saying goodbye to departing passengers. When Sarah reached her, Jessica's eyes held genuine warmth. "Safe travels," Jessica said softly. "Thank you," Sarah replied. "And thank you for trying." Jessica's expression flickered with understanding. She knew Sarah had overheard something. "I'm sorry," Jessica whispered. "I'm so sorry." Sarah just nodded and kept walking. They stepped off the plane into the jetway, and Sarah felt relief wash over her. It was done. The flight was over. They'd survived. But Elijah's hand tightened around hers. "Mama," he said. "Wait." "What's wrong?" "We need to talk to someone." "Talk to who?" "Someone in charge." Elijah's voice was steady, certain. "About what happened?" Sarah stopped walking. Passengers flowed around them, annoyed at the obstruction. "Elijah, I just want to get to Grandma. I don't want to deal with—" "Mama." He looked up at her, and his eyes held something that made her breath catch. "You teach people to save lives. You say when you see something wrong, you have a responsibility, not to be mean, but to make sure it doesn't happen to the next person." He was using her own words, her own lessons, reflecting them back at her. "You can't stand up for yourself today because you're tired from standing up for everyone else," Elijah continued. "So I'm standing up for you." Sarah's vision blurred with tears. "Please, Mama, trust me." She looked at her son, her beautiful, brave 8-year-old son, and felt something break open in her chest. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, baby. What do you need me to do?" "Just be here with me. I'll do the talking." They moved against the flow of passengers, back toward the gate area. Sarah had no idea what Elijah was planning, but she followed his lead. The gate area was chaos. New passengers boarding the return flight, crew members transitioning, airline staff managing controlled chaos. Elijah scanned the area with those careful, observant eyes. Then he saw her, standing near the gate desk, reviewing a tablet, was a woman in a different uniform, not a flight attendant uniform. Something more formal, a captain's uniform, for stripes on the shoulders. She was a black woman, probably in her 50s, with natural hair cut short, strong features, and an air of authority that made space around her feel quieter just from her presence. Her name tag read Captain Helen Reeves. Elijah walked straight toward her. Sarah followed, heart pounding, having no idea what her son was about to do. Elijah stopped a respectful distance away and waited until Captain Reeves looked up from her tablet. "Excuse me, Captain Reeves?" His voice was clear, polite, surprisingly adult. Helen looked down at him, surprise flickering across her face. "Yes. My name is Elijah Montgomery. I was a passenger on Flight 2847 from Seattle. I need to report discrimination that occurred during the flight." The words hung in the air. Helen's expression shifted, surprise giving way to careful attention. She glanced at Sarah, then back at Elijah. "Discrimination?" she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." Helen set down her tablet. She knelt down slowly, coming to Elijah's eye level, and the gesture was so deliberate so respectful that Sarah felt tears prick her eyes again. "Tell me everything," Helen said quietly. "If you believe that even the smallest voices deserve to be heard, subscribe, because sometimes the most powerful moment of change begins with a single act of courage." Elijah didn't hesitate. He didn't cry. He didn't stumble over his words. He didn't exaggerate or dramatize. He simply opened his blue notebook and began to present facts. On Flight 2847 from Seattle to Atlanta, departing at 6:43 a.m., my mother and I were seated in row 32, seats A and B. Elijah began, his voice steady. Our flight attendant was Monica. I don't know her last name, but her name tag said Monica, and she had employee number 74812 visible on her badge. Helen's eyebrows rose slightly. She pulled out her own tablet, began taking notes. At approximately 7:15 a.m., my mother asked Monica for a blanket because I was cold. Monica said there were no blankets left and that they'd been distributed to first class during boarding. Then she said, Elijah checked his notebook, reading the exact quote. "If you wanted a blanket, you should have requested one earlier. In the future, perhaps you should fly on an airline more suited to your budget." Helen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She said this loud enough for other passengers to hear. Elijah continued. My mother apologized even though she hadn't done anything wrong. He flipped a page in his notebook. At approximately 9:07 a.m., during meal service, Monica provided one meal for our row, even though there were two of us. When my mother pointed this out, Monica claimed there was a catering shortage, but I observed that every other row in our section received full meal service. The passenger across the aisle from us, Mr. David Chun in seat 32C, had intervened before Monica brought a second meal. Helen was writing quickly now, her expression unreadable but intense. I also observed Monica's behavior throughout the entire flight, Elijah said. She smiled and made eye contact with white passengers and Asian passengers, but avoided eye contact with all black passengers. When Mr. James Richardson in seat 26D pressed his call button, Monica took 7 minutes to respond. When Mrs. Patricia Hoffman in seat 28F pressed her call button, Monica responded in 90 seconds. I timed both instances. Sarah stood behind Elijah, her hand on his shoulder, unable to speak. She'd had no idea he'd been documenting everything with such precision. At approximately 10:35 a.m., Elijah continued, his voice never wavering. I overheard a conversation between Monica and another flight attendant named Jessica near the rear galley. Monica said, he checked his notes again. They're lucky to be on this flight at all. You know how many complaints we get about people who don't belong in these spaces. Helen looked up sharply. You heard her say that? Yes, ma'am. She also said, I've seen their type before. They act entitled. They make demands. They play the victim card when they don't get special treatment. And when Jessica questioned her, Monica said, I just prioritize the passengers who actually matter, the business class flyers, the frequent flyers, the people who keep this airline running. Elijah turned another page. Monica also told Jessica that she has seniority, a perfect record, and management that backs her up, which suggests this isn't the first time she's discriminated against passengers. Just the first time someone documented it thoroughly enough to report. Helen sat back on her heels, staring at this 8-year-old boy with something close to awe. How old are you, Elijah? She asked quietly. 8, ma'am. And you documented all of this during the flight? Yes, ma'am. My mother is a nurse. She taught me that when you witness something wrong, you document it. Because memory isn't reliable as evidence, but written records are. Helen glanced up at Sarah, who was openly crying now, tears streaming down her face. Ms. Montgomery, Helen said gently, standing to her full height, is everything your son just described accurate? Sarah could barely speak. Yes, all of it. Helen nodded slowly. Then she looked at Elijah again. Can I ask you something? Yes, ma'am. Why did you document all of this? You're 8 years old. You should have been enjoying your first flight, looking out the window, being excited. Instead, you spent the entire time recording instances of discrimination. Why? Elijah met her eyes without flinching. Because my mama teaches people save lives, he said. She says when you see something wrong, you have a responsibility, not to be mean, but to make sure it doesn't happen to the next person. She can't stand up for herself today because she's tired from standing up for everyone else. So I'm standing up for her. The gate area around them had gone quiet. Other passengers were watching now, listening. Some had phones out, recording. Helen's eyes shimmered with emotion, but her voice remained steady and professional. "Come with me," she said. She led them away from the gate, down a corridor, to a door marked Crew Operations. She swiped her badge, and the door clicked open. Inside was a small office with desks, computers, filing cabinets, and two other crew members who looked up in surprise when Helen entered with Sarah and Elijah. "I need the room," Helen said firmly. The crew members exchanged glances, then quickly left. Helen gestured to chairs. "Please, sit down." Sarah and Elijah sat. Helen remained standing for a moment, composing herself. Then she pulled out her phone and made a call. "This is Captain Reeves. I need you in the crew operations office at Gate B 17 immediately. We have a serious incident to address regarding Flight 2847. She paused. "No, it can't wait. Now, please." She hung up and turned back to Elijah and Sarah. "I want you to know something," Helen said, her voice carrying weight. "I've been flying for 22 years. I was the third black woman to ever captain for this airline. I've experienced more discrimination than I can count, from passengers, from crew members, from people who thought someone who looks like me couldn't possibly know how to fly a plane." She pulled up a chair and sat facing them. "And I have spent 2 decades fighting to make sure the people who come after me don't have to face the same things I did. So when I tell you that what happened to you today is unacceptable, I want you to understand that I don't just mean it professionally. I mean it personally." Sarah found her voice. "Thank you, but I don't want to cause trouble. We just want to—" "You didn't cause trouble, Ms. Montgomery. Someone else did, and they're going to be held accountable." There was a knock at the door. Helen called, "Come in." A man in a suit entered, older, white, with graying hair and a harried expression. "Helen, what's this about? We're in the middle of—" "Sit down, Robert," Helen said, her tone leaving no room for argument. The man, apparently someone in management, sat. Helen handed him her tablet. "Read the notes I just took." Robert scanned the screen, his expression shifting from irritation to concern to something darker. This is a serious allegation," he said carefully. "It's not an allegation. It's a documented account provided by a witness with detailed notes, specific times, exact quotes, and observable patterns." Helen's voice was ice. "And based on what I'm hearing, this isn't an isolated incident. We'll need to investigate." "Yes, you will. Starting immediately. I want Monica pulled from active duty, pending a full investigation. I want passenger witness statements collected. Mr. Davidson in 32C can corroborate the meal service incident. I want Jessica." She looked at Elijah. What was Jessica's last name on her name tag? "Anderson." Elijah supplied. "I want Jessica Anderson's statement about the conversation she overheard. And I want Monica's personnel file pulled to see if there have been previous complaints that were ignored or buried." Robert's face had gone pale. "Helen, we can't just—" "Yes, we can. We should have done it long before now." Helen's eyes were hard. "How many other passengers has Monica treated like this, Robert? How many complaints have been filed and dismissed because it was easier than dealing with the problem? That's not fair. What's not fair is an 8-year-old child having spent his first flight documenting discrimination instead of enjoying the experience. What's not fair is a nurse who works herself to exhaustion being told she should fly on a cheaper airline. What's not fair is systematic mistreatment being protected by seniority and perfect records that are only perfect because no one's looked closely enough." The office fell silent. Robert exhaled slowly. "All right, I'll make the calls. But this is going to create a lot of complications." "Good. Complications mean change. And change is long overdue." Robert left, already pulling out his phone. Helen turned back to Sarah and Elijah. "I need to ask you something difficult," she said gently. "Are you willing to give formal statements? To potentially speak with investigators? This could take time, and I know you're here to see your mother. Yes, Sarah said immediately. We'll do whatever it takes. Helen nodded. Thank you. And Elijah, she looked at the boy. Can I see your notebook? Elijah hesitated for just a moment, then handed it over. Helen read through the pages carefully, her expression growing more serious with each entry. When she finished, she looked at Elijah with undisguised admiration. This is remarkable documentation, she said quietly. I've seen professional investigators with less detailed notes. Where did you learn to do this? My mama, Elijah said simply. She documents everything at her job. Patient conditions, medication times, treatment responses. She says details save lives. She's right. Helen handed the notebook back. And today, your details are going to save more people from being treated the way your mother was. Over the next hour, things moved quickly. Monica was called into a supervisor's office. At first, she came in confident, confused about what the problem could possibly be. That confidence evaporated when she saw Helen. Saw Robert's serious expression, saw the note spread out on the desk. These are allegations from a passenger. She started defensive. You know how passengers can be. These are documented observations from multiple witnesses, Helen corrected, with times, quotes, and specific examples of differential treatment. I treat all passengers professionally. You told a woman she should fly on a cheaper airline. You denied meal service to a child until another passenger intervened. You admitted to another crew member that you prioritize passengers who matter and ignore those who don't. Helen's voice was calm but unyielding. And according to the conversation you had with Flight Attendant Anderson, this is part of a pattern you've established over your 12-year career. Monica's face flushed red. That's taken out of context. Then provide the context. Silence. I want my union representative, Monica finally said. You're entitled to one. But as of this moment, you're suspended from active duty pending a full investigation. You'll surrender your badge and employee credentials. Monica's eyes widened. You can't. We absolutely can. And we are. Sarah and Elijah weren't present for this conversation. They were in a separate room giving their formal statements to an investigator. But Helen told them about it later, her satisfaction evident. The investigator who took their statements was a middle-aged black woman named Patricia Cole, who worked in the airline's HR department. She listened to Sarah's account, then Elijah's, with careful attention, taking detailed notes and asking clarifying questions. How many other passengers did you observe Monica treating differently? Patricia asked Elijah. Elijah consulted his notebook. 7 black passengers total, including us. She avoided eye contact with all of them, responded slowly or not at all to call buttons, and spoke in a colder tone compared to white and Asian passengers. And you're certain about the conversation you overheard between Monica and Jessica Anderson? Yes, ma'am. I can recite it word for word if you need me to. Patricia's expression softened. That won't be necessary. Your notes are very thorough. She turned to Sarah. Ms. Montgomery, I want to apologize on behalf of this airline. What you experienced today was completely unacceptable, and I'm ashamed that it happened under our watch. Thank you, Sarah said quietly. But I don't want apologies. I want accountability. I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. It won't, Patricia said firmly. I can promise you that. While Sarah and Elijah gave their statements, Helen made more calls. She called the gate agent and got contact information from Mr. David Chun, who was waiting for a connecting flight. When she reached him, he confirmed everything Elijah had documented and offered to provide a written statement. That young man was writing in his notebook the entire flight. David said over the phone, I've been a civil rights attorney for 40 years, and I've never seen anyone, let alone a child, document discrimination with such precision. His mother should be incredibly proud. She is, Helen assured him. And so am I. Helen also tracked down Jessica Anderson, who was on a layover in Atlanta. Jessica came to the office immediately, clearly shaken. I tried to say something to Monica, Jessica said, her voice trembling, but she shut me down, said she had seniority and management backing, and I should drop it. I should have pushed harder. I should have reported it myself. You did try, Helen said gently. That matters. And now you're going to help us make sure Monica doesn't get away with this. Jessica gave her statement, corroborating everything Elijah had overheard and adding additional context about Monica's behavior patterns she'd observed over the 6 months they'd worked together. She's always been cold to certain passengers, Jessica said. Mostly black passengers, sometimes Latino passengers. I noticed it, but I didn't know what to do. I'm only 23. I'm new to this job, and Monica has been doing this for over a decade. I thought maybe I was reading too much into it. You weren't, Helen said. And from now on, if you see something like this, you report immediately. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am. While all of this was happening, Robert was making his own calls to the legal department, to upper management, to the union. The picture that emerged was damning. There had been complaints about Monica before. Not many, only 3 in 12 years, but they'd been dismissed as passenger misunderstandings or cultural differences in communication styles. No investigation had ever been conducted. No disciplinary action had ever been taken. Monica's perfect record was only perfect because the airline had chosen not to look closely at the red flags. And now those red flags were about to become a wildfire. By the time Sarah and Elijah finished giving their statements, it was late afternoon. They'd been in the airport for hours, and Sarah suddenly remembered why they were there in the first place. "Grandma," she said, panic rising, "we need to get to the hospital." "I've already arranged for a car service to take you," Helen said. "It's waiting outside, and I've called the hospital to let them know you were delayed but are on your way." Sarah stared at her. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did." Helen's expression was gentle. "Your mother needs to see you, and you need to see her. This investigation will continue, but your family comes first." Sarah's tears returned. "Thank you for everything, for believing us, for taking this seriously, for—" "You don't need to thank me for doing what should have been done a long time ago." Helen looked at Elijah. "Your son reminded me why I do this job, why it matters to fight for what's right, even when it's difficult." She knelt down to Elijah's level one more time. "You did something incredibly brave today," she said quietly. "Most adults wouldn't have had the courage to speak up the way you did. You should be very proud of yourself." "I learned from my mama," Elijah said, his voice small now, the weight of the day finally catching up to him. "Your mama is lucky to have you, and I'm lucky I got to meet you." Helen stood and handed Sarah a business card. "This has my direct number. If you need anything at all, you call me. Understand?" Sarah nodded, unable to speak. Helen walked them out to the car that was waiting, a black sedan with a professional driver who loaded their bag and held the door for them as they pulled away from the airport. Sarah finally let herself collapse against the seat, exhaustion and emotion overwhelming her. Elijah climbed into her lap, even though he was really too big for it, and she held him close. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered into his hair. "So incredibly proud. Are you mad that I made a stay?" "No, baby. No. You did exactly the right thing." They rode in silence for a while, watching Atlanta pass by the windows. Then Elijah said quietly, "Mama, do you think it'll actually change anything? Or will they just forget about it once we're gone?" Sarah thought about Captain Helen Reeves, about the fire in her eyes, about the way she'd taken Elijah's notebook like it was sacred text. "I think," Sarah said slowly, "that when you speak truth to power, sometimes power has no choice but to listen. And I think Captain Reeves is going to make sure they not only listen, but act." "Good," Elijah murmured, his eyes already starting to close. "Because people like Monica shouldn't get to keep hurting people." "No, baby, they shouldn't." The hospital was a 40-minute drive from the airport. By the time they arrived, Elijah was asleep in Sarah's arms, his notebook clutched against his chest. Sarah carried him through the hospital corridors, following the room numbers until she found her mother's room. Dorothy was awake, propped up in bed, looking frail but alert. When she saw Sarah appear in the doorway with Elijah, her face transformed with joy. "My babies," she whispered. Sarah set Elijah down gently, and he woke, blinking in confusion before he saw his grandmother. "Grandma!" He rushed to her bedside, careful not to jostle her. Dorothy reached for him with a trembling hand, touching his face like she couldn't quite believe he was real. "My brilliant boy," she said softly. "You got so big." "We flew here, Grandma," Elijah said, "on an airplane. Did you now? Was it wonderful?" Elijah paused, glancing at his mother. Sarah shook her head slightly. This wasn't the time to burden Dorothy with what had happened. "It was my first flight," Elijah said instead. "I saw the clouds from above, and the city looked so small like a map. Magic, isn't it?" Dorothy smiled. "Flying." Sarah pulled a chair close to the bed, took her mother's other hand, and for the first time in hours, felt something close to peace. They were here. They were together. And somewhere back at that airport, wheels were turning. Investigations were beginning. Change was coming. Because an 8-year-old boy had refused to let injustice disappear into silence. If you ever stayed quiet when you should have spoken up, this is your reminder that it's never too late to find your voice. What would you do if you witnessed what Elijah saw? 3 days passed. Sarah spent them at her mother's bedside, reading to her, talking quietly, simply being present. Dorothy's condition was stable but tenuous. The stroke had weakened her left side, and the doctor said recovery would be slow. Elijah stayed with them, sleeping on a fold-out chair in a hospital room, eating cafeteria food, doing homework that Sarah had brought along. He was quiet, processing everything that had happened, occasionally adding notes to his blue notebook about other things he observed. On the 4th day, Helen called. "Ms. Montgomery, it's Captain Reeves. Do you have a moment to talk?" Sarah stepped out into the hallway. "Yes. Is everything all right?" "More than all right. I wanted to update you on the investigation." Sarah's heart rate picked up. "Okay. Monica has been terminated," Helen said directly, effective immediately. "The investigation uncovered not only the incidents from your flight, but a pattern of discriminatory behavior going back years. We found complaints that had been filed and dismissed, passenger comments that were ignored, and testimony from other crew members who'd witnessed similar behavior but felt they couldn't report it." Sarah leaned against the wall, overwhelmed. "She's really gone?" "She is. And there's more." Helen's voice carried satisfaction. The investigation revealed systemic failures in how discrimination complaints were handled. As a result, the airline is implementing mandatory bias training for all employees, creating a direct hotline for discrimination complaints that bypasses immediate supervisors, and establishing an independent review board to examine all future incidents. Because of what Elijah reported? Because your son refused to accept that discrimination was just part of the experience. Because he documented everything with such precision that the airline couldn't dismiss it or minimize it. And because his courage inspired other people to come forward with their own stories. Sarah closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. Thank you for taking us seriously. Thank you for raising a remarkable child." Helen paused. "There's one more thing. I'd like to offer Elijah something, if you'll allow it." "What's that?" "I run a mentorship program for young people interested in aviation, particularly young people from underrepresented communities. I'd like to offer Elijah a spot in the program. It includes educational resources, airport tours, opportunities to meet pilots and crew members, and guidance on potential career paths in aviation. Completely free, no obligation, just an opportunity." Sarah's breath caught. "He would love that. He's obsessed with airplanes." "I know," Helen said warmly. "I could tell. So what do you say?" "Yes. Absolutely yes." "Wonderful. I'll send you all the information. And Ms. Montgomery, one more thing." "Yes." "The airline would like to offer you a formal apology, in writing, along with a full refund of your tickets, compensation for emotional distress, and a travel voucher for future flights. It's not enough. Nothing can undo what happened, but it's a start." Sarah didn't care about the money, but she cared about the acknowledgement, the recognition that what happened was wrong. "Thank you," she whispered. "Take care of your mother. Take care of yourself. And tell Elijah that he changed more than he knows." The call ended, and Sarah stood in that hospital hallway, shaking with emotion. She went back into the room, where Elijah was showing Dorothy a drawing he'd made of an airplane. "Baby," Sarah said softly, "I just talked to Captain Reeves." Elijah looked up. "She said Monica was fired, and that the airline is making changes because of what you reported." Elijah absorbed this information silently. Then he said, "Good. Maybe it won't happen to other people now." "Maybe it won't," Sarah agreed. "And Captain Reeves wants to invite you to join her aviation mentorship program. She thinks you'd be a great pilot someday." Elijah's eyes widened. "Really? Really?" Dorothy reached out and squeezed Elijah's hand. "My brilliant boy," she said again, "already changing the world." The days turned into weeks. Dorothy's recovery was slow but steady. Sarah stayed with her, taking unpaid leave from work she couldn't really afford but needed desperately. Elijah attended a local school temporarily, making friends with other kids in the hospital's family waiting room. And back across the country, the investigation's ripple effects continued. The story went public, not through Sarah or Elijah, who wanted privacy, but through other passengers who'd been on the flight and witnessed what happened. News outlets picked it up. 8-year-old's courage sparks airline discrimination investigation. The airline, facing public scrutiny, doubled down on their reforms. The CEO released a statement acknowledging systemic failures and pledging comprehensive change. Jessica Anderson, the flight attendant who tried to intervene, was promoted to a training position where she'd helped develop the new bias education program. Mr. Davidson wrote an op-ed about what he'd witnessed, about the power of documentation, about how sometimes justice requires ordinary people to take extraordinary stands. And Monica disappeared from public view. Her 12-year career ended by the same attitude she thought would protect her. Helen kept in touch with Sarah regularly. She sent Elijah books about aviation, models of different aircraft, videos of cockpit procedures. She arranged for him to visit an air traffic control tower during a field trip, where he spent 2 hours asking questions that impressed the controllers with their depth and specificity. "Your son has an exceptional mind," Helen told Sarah during one call. "And more importantly, he has an exceptional heart. That's rare." 6 weeks after the flight, Dorothy was strong enough to be discharged. Sarah made arrangements to bring her back to Seattle, where she could live with them and continue her recovery. The night before they flew home, Sarah sat with Elijah in their hotel room, packing their belongings. "Are you nervous about flying again?" she asked carefully. Elijah considered this. "A little, but Captain Reeves said she's arranged for us to board first, and she's going to be on our flight." "She's flying with us?" "She switched her schedule. She said she wanted to make sure our last flight was different from our first flight." Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, something that happens so easily these days. The next morning, they arrived at the airport early. Helen met them at the gate. In full uniform, her captain's stripes gleaming. "Ready?" she asked Elijah. He nodded. Helen walked them onto the plane before anyone else boarded. The crew was different. All new faces, all trained in the new protocols, all genuinely warm. Helen showed Elijah the cockpit, introduced him to her co-pilot, let him sit in the captain's seat and touch the controls. "Someday," Helen said quietly, "this will be your seat." "You think so?" Elijah asked. "I know so. You've already proven you have what it takes. Courage, integrity, attention to detail. Those are the qualities that make great pilots." When the other passengers boarded, Sarah and Elijah were settled in their seats, upgraded to first class. Helen's doing. Dorothy sat across the aisle from them, bundled in a blanket, smiling at the luxury of extra legroom. The flight was everything the first one hadn't been. The crew was attentive without being intrusive. The service was warm and genuine. When Elijah asked for apple juice, the flight attendant brought it with a smile and asked if he liked cookies too. No one stared. No one whispered. No one made them feel like they didn't belong. Helen came back from a cockpit twice during the flight to check on them, sitting in the empty seat beside Elijah and answering his endless questions about flight procedures. "You know what I think?" Helen said during her second visit. "I think you're going to do something important with your life. Elijah, maybe you'll be a pilot." Maybe you'll be something else entirely. But whatever you do, you're going to change things for the better, because you already have. When they landed in Seattle, Helen walked them off the plane personally. This isn't goodbye, she told them. You're part of my mentorship program now. I'll see you again soon. She hugged Sarah, then knelt down one last time to Elijah's level. Keep that notebook, she said, tapping the blue cover sticking out of his backpack. Keep documenting. Keep questioning. Keep fighting for what's right. The world needs people like you. Thank you for believing me, Elijah said quietly. Thank you for giving me something to believe in. Sarah, Elijah, and Dorothy took a taxi home from the airport. The city looked different somehow. Brighter, more full of possibility. That night, after Dorothy was settled in Elijah's room, he'd insisted she take his bed while he slept on the couch. Sarah sat with her son at the kitchen table. You know what happened, right? She said softly. You understand what you did? I reported discrimination, Elijah said simply. You did more than that, baby. You changed policy. You changed culture. You made it safer for other people who look like us to travel, without fear of being mistreated. Elijah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I just didn't want her to keep hurting people. It didn't seem fair. It wasn't fair, and you made it right. Not just me. You taught me how. Captain Reeves helped. Mr. Chin helped. Even Jessica helped. Sarah smiled. That's true, but you started it. You were brave when you could have been scared. You spoke up when you could have stayed silent. That matters, Elijah. That matters so much. Elijah pulled out his blue notebook and opened it to a fresh page. What are you writing now? Sarah asked. A new list, Elijah said, of other things that aren't fair, so I can document them too. Sarah's heart swelled with pride and ached with worry in equal measure, because she knew her son would spend his life fighting injustice wherever he found it. And while that made her incredibly proud, also scared her, because fighting was exhausting and costly, and sometimes people fought their whole lives without seeing change. But then she thought about Monica terminated, about the new policies in place, about the hotline for discrimination complaints, about the independent review board. Real change, tangible change. Because one 8-year-old boy refused to accept that things couldn't be different. Over the following months, the story continued to unfold. The airline's reforms became a model for other carriers. Industry publications wrote about the case, holding it up as an example of how individual acts of courage could drive institutional change. Helen's mentorship program expanded, serving more young people than ever before. Elijah became something of an unofficial spokesperson for it, his story inspiring other kids to pursue aviation careers they thought were beyond their reach. Sarah returned to work at the hospital, where her co-workers had followed the news coverage. They treated her with a new kind of respect, not because she'd been on TV, but because they'd seen her strength, her dignity, her refusal to let her son's voice be diminished. Dorothy recovered steadily, her speech improving, her left side growing stronger. She loved living with Sarah and Elijah, loved being part of their daily life, loved watching her grandson grow in confidence and purpose. And Elijah continued to document. He documented the teacher, who called on white students more than students of color. He documented the store security guard, who followed black shoppers. He documented the school administrator, who suspended black students at twice the rate of white students for the same infractions. And each time, he presented his findings to the appropriate authorities, not with anger, not with accusation, but with calm, clear, detailed evidence that was impossible to dismiss. Some of those authorities listened. Some didn't. But enough listened that small changes began to happen. A teacher attended additional training. A store revised its security protocols. A school board member started asking uncomfortable questions about disciplinary disparities. Sarah watched her son become an agent of change, and while it frightened her sometimes, she also knew she wouldn't stop him, because he was right. When you see something wrong, you have a responsibility, not to be mean, but to make sure it doesn't happen to the next person. 1 year after flight, Helen invited Sarah and Elijah to attend an aviation industry conference where she was receiving an award for her work promoting diversity in airline careers. They flew out on the same airline because Helen insisted, and the flight was perfect. Smooth, professional, warm. At the conference, Helen gave a speech about the importance of representation, of creating spaces where everyone felt welcome, of listening when people spoke up about discrimination. And then she did something Sarah and Elijah weren't expecting. She called Elijah up to the stage. He climbed the steps, looking small under the bright lights, his blue notebook tucked under his arm. "This young man," Helen said, her voice carrying to the conference hall, "changed my airline, not through violence, not through anger, but through courage and documentation, and an unwillingness to accept that injustice was just the way things were." She looked at Elijah. "He was 8 years old when he taught me, and an entire industry, that the smallest voices can carry the greatest truth, that speaking up matters. That change is possible when ordinary people take extraordinary stands." The audience applauded, and Elijah stood there, uncomfortable with the attention but understanding its importance. "I want to announce," Helen continued, "the establishment of the Elijah Montgomery Scholarship Fund. This fund will provide financial support for young people from underrepresented communities who want to pursue careers in aviation, because this industry needs more people who think like Elijah, who question, who document, who refuse to accept inequality as inevitable." The applause grew louder. Helen handed Elijah a plaque, shook his hand formally, then pulled him into a hug. "You changed my life," she whispered into his ear. "Never forget that." When Sarah and Elijah returned home, something had shifted. People recognized Elijah now, not as a celebrity, but as a symbol. Teachers pointed to his example when discussing civil rights. Parents told their children his story when teaching them about courage. And slowly, quietly, the culture began to change. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't immediate. But it was real. Flight attendants were more careful, more aware, more trained to recognize their own biases. Passengers felt more empowered to speak up when they witnessed discrimination. Airlines took complaints more seriously, knowing that ignoring them could lead to the kind of public reckoning that had followed Elijah's report. One person, one notebook, one refusal to stay silent. That's all it had taken to start a ripple that became a wave. Would you have had the courage to document injustice like Elijah did, knowing it might not change anything? Or would you have stayed silent and hoped someone else would speak up? 5 years later, Elijah was 13 years old. He was taller now, his voice deeper, his features beginning to show the young man he'd become. But his eyes still held that same careful observation, that same unwavering focus. The blue notebook was worn now, its pages filled with 5 years of documentation. He'd filled 2 more notebooks since the flight, each one a chronicle of injustices witnessed and reported, of changes made and battles fought. Sarah was still a nurse at County General, but she'd been promoted to charge nurse, leading a team and training new staff. She'd become known for her meticulous documentation and her unwillingness to let systemic problems go unaddressed. Dorothy lived with them still, fully recovered, spending her days volunteering at a community center and spoiling her grandson with wisdom and unconditional love. And Helen had become like family, visiting regularly, mentoring Elijah, creating opportunities for him to learn and grow. Elijah had joined Helen's aviation program immediately after the flight, and he'd thrived. He'd taken every class, attended every workshop, absorbed every piece of knowledge with the same intensity he brought to everything. By 13, he could explain the physics of flight better than most adult pilots. He'd logged hours in flight simulators. He'd shadowed air traffic controllers, mechanics, airline executives, understanding every piece of the aviation industry. But more than that, he'd become an advocate. He spoke at schools about the importance of documentation, of speaking up, of refusing to accept discrimination as normal. He testified before the city council about disparities in school discipline. He presented findings to hospital administrators about racial bias in pain treatment. He used his voice, his notebooks, his careful observations to shine light on problems others preferred to ignore. And slowly, incrementally, things changed. On the 5-year anniversary of the flight, a documentary crew contacted Sarah. They wanted to tell Elijah's story, not as inspiration porn, not as a feel-good narrative, but as a serious examination of how one child's courage had sparked meaningful reform in the airline industry and beyond. Sarah was hesitant. She didn't want Elijah's life reduced to a story, didn't want it defined by one moment. But Elijah said yes. If telling our story helps other people find their courage, he said, then it's worth it. The documentary took 6 months to film. The crew followed Elijah through his daily life, school, mentorship program sessions, community meetings where he presented findings from his latest documentation projects. They interviewed Helen, who spoke about how Elijah had fundamentally changed her understanding of what courage looked like. They interviewed Jessica Anderson, who'd left her flight attendant position to become a full-time diversity and inclusion trainer, inspired by Elijah's example. They interviewed Mr. David Chun, now 77, who called Elijah the most important civil rights activist of his generation. They interviewed Sarah, who cried through most of her interview, talking about her pride and her fear and her fierce protectiveness of her remarkable son. And they interviewed other people whose lives had been touched by Elijah's advocacy, students whose school discipline policies had changed after his documentation, families who'd received better medical care because of his reports about bias in health care, passengers who'd flown without fear of discrimination because of reforms his courage had sparked. The documentary premiered at a film festival and won awards. It was picked up by a major streaming platform and watched by millions. And the message it carried was simple but powerful. Ordinary people can create extraordinary change. Small acts of courage ripple outward in ways we can't predict. Truth, documented and spoken clearly, has power that can't be ignored. After the documentary aired, Elijah received thousands of messages from people around the world. Kids who'd started their own documentation projects, following his example. Adults who'd finally reported discrimination they'd been experiencing for years. Organizations that wanted him to speak, to train their staff, to help them create better systems. It was overwhelming. And sometimes, Elijah felt crushed under the weight of expectations. One night, he sat at the kitchen table with Sarah, staring at his newest notebook, unable to write. "What's wrong, baby?" Sarah asked gently. "I don't know if I can keep doing this." Elijah said quietly, "Everyone expects me to fix everything, to always have the answer, to never be scared or tired or angry." Sarah pulled her chair close to his. "You're 13 years old. Elijah, you're allowed to be all those things. But people are depending on me." "No, baby, people are inspired by you. There's a difference." She took his hand. "You started something important when you were 8 years old, but you don't have to carry it alone. Other people have picked up the work too. You create a movement, and movements are bigger than any one person. What if I just want to be a kid sometimes? Then you be a kid. You play video games and hang out with friends and worry about homework and normal 13-year-old things. Your value isn't in what you accomplish. It's in who you are." Elijah's eyes filled with tears. "I'm tired, Mama." "I know, baby. I know." Sarah held him while he cried. The first time he'd really let himself cry in years. All the pressure, all the responsibility, all the weight of being a symbol when he just wanted to be a boy. When the tears finally stopped, Elijah pulled back and wiped his face. "I don't want to stop," he said. "I just need to remember it's okay to rest sometimes. More than okay. Necessary. Will you help me remember that? Every single day." Elijah took a few months away from public advocacy after that conversation. He focused on school, on friends, on learning to fly in the small aircraft Helen had arranged access to through the mentorship program. His 14th birthday was approaching, and Helen had promised that when he turned 16, she'd help him get his pilot's license. But even while resting from public work, Elijah couldn't stop noticing, couldn't stop documenting. It was part of who he was now, this awareness of injustice, this inability to unsee patterns once he'd recognized them. He just learned to set boundaries around what he could address and what he needed to let others handle. One afternoon, Elijah was at the library studying when he overheard a conversation. A young black mother was trying to sign her daughter up for a summer reading program, but the librarian was making it difficult, asking for excessive documentation, questioning the family's address, suggesting they try a different library branch. Elijah watched for a few minutes, his hands clenching with familiar anger. Then he stood up, walked over, and pulled out his phone. "Excuse me," he said politely to the librarian. I'd like to document this interaction for a community access project I'm working on. Do I have your permission to record? The librarian's attitude changed instantly. Suddenly, she found the mother's documentation acceptable. Suddenly, registration was simple. The mother thanked Elijah afterward, tears in her eyes. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did," Elijah replied. "We look out for each other." That night, Elijah added the incident to his notebook, not because he planned to pursue it further, but because documentation mattered, because patterns mattered, because truth mattered. When he turned 16, true to her promise, Helen helped him get his pilot's license. The day he soloed for the first time, flying a small Cessna with no instructor, just himself in the sky, Sarah and Dorothy and Helen all stood on the ground watching. When he landed, executed a perfect touchdown, and taxied back to hangar, Sarah ran to him and held him so tight he could barely breathe. "My baby," she sobbed. "You're flying." "I'm flying, Mama." Helen stood back, watching with tears streaming down her face. "You know what this means?" she said when Sarah finally released him. "You're the youngest black pilot to solo in this state's history." Elijah smiled, not with pride in breaking records, but with joy in doing something he loved. "It means I'm free," he said simply. That freedom carried him through high school. He excelled academically, joined the debate team, made friends with kids who knew his story but loved him for who he was, not what he'd done. He continued his advocacy work, but on his own terms, in his own time. He helped establish documentation training programs in schools, teaching other young people how to recognize and report injustice. He worked with Helen to expand the aviation mentorship program to 10 cities across the country. He testified before Congress about racial bias in transportation systems, his testimony calm and detailed and impossible to dismiss. And through it all, he remained fundamentally himself, observant, careful, kind, unwilling to let cruelty go unchallenged, but equally unwilling to let anger consume him. When Elijah was 17, he received a letter. It was from Monica, the flight attendant who'd been fired 5 years earlier. Sarah found him reading it in his room, his face unreadable. "What does it say?" she asked carefully. Elijah handed her the letter. Monica had written to apologize. She explained that being fired had forced her to confront the biases she'd spent years denying. She'd gone to therapy, done serious self-reflection, understood the harm she'd caused. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't ask Elijah to respond. She just wanted him to know that his courage had changed her too, not just her employment status, but her understanding of herself and the world. "I was wrong," she'd written, "and you were right, and I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to see that." Sarah looked at her son. "How do you feel about this?" Elijah was quiet for a long time. "I feel sad," he finally said. Sad that she had to hurt so many people before she learned. Sad that it took being punished to make her change. But also, I don't know, maybe a little hopeful, that people can change, even when it seems impossible. "Are you going to write back?" "I don't think so. She doesn't need my forgiveness to move forward, and I don't need to give it to move forward. We're just separate now." Sarah nodded, understanding the wisdom in her son's words. When Elijah graduated high school, he was valedictorian. His speech didn't mention the flight, didn't mention discrimination, didn't mention any of the work he'd done. Instead, he talked about documentation as a form of love. "When we pay attention to each other," he said, standing before his class, "when we notice injustice and refuse to look away, when we document truth even when it's uncomfortable, we're saying that people matter, that their experiences are valid, that their pain is real and deserves to be acknowledged. My mother taught me to document," he continued, "not out of anger, but out of love, because she loved me enough to teach me that I had power, even when systems told me I didn't, because she loved strangers enough to want the world to be better for them. So, whatever you do with your lives, pay attention, document the truth, stand up when you see injustice, not because it's easy, but because love demands it." The audience stood and applauded for 3 full minutes. Sarah sat in the front row, crying and clapping and bursting with pride. Dorothy sat beside her, squeezing her hand, whispering, "That's our boy. That's our brilliant boy." and Helen sat behind them, thinking about that 8-year-old child who'd walked up there 5 years ago with a blue notebook and changed everything. Elijah was accepted to several universities with full scholarships. He chose one with a strong aeronautical engineering program, planning to eventually become a commercial pilot and maybe someday work on making aviation more accessible and equitable. Before he left for college, he did one final thing. He donated his original blue notebook, the one from the flight, to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. It was placed in an exhibit about everyday resistance, alongside other artifacts of people who'd fought for justice in quiet, persistent ways. The museum description read, "This notebook, kept by 8-year-old Elijah Montgomery during a 2021 flight, contains documentation of racial discrimination that sparked significant airline industry reforms. It represents the power of careful observation, the importance of speaking truth to power, and the extraordinary courage of ordinary people." On his last night before leaving for college, Elijah sat with Sarah and Dorothy in their living room. "Are you scared?" Dorothy asked. "A little," Elijah admitted, "but mostly excited." "We're so proud of you," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "I know, Mama. I'm proud of us. We did this together. You did the hard part." "No." Elijah shook his head. "You did the hard part. You raised me. You taught me. You believed in me when I was just a little kid with a notebook. Everything I am comes from you." Sarah pulled him close, breathing in the scent of him, memorizing this moment before he flew away, literally and figuratively, into his own life. "Promise me something," she whispered. "Anything. Promise me you'll remember that your value isn't in what you accomplish or how many people you help. It's just in being you. My son, my beautiful, brilliant, kind son. I promise, Mama." And he kept that promise. Throughout college, Elijah continued his advocacy work, but he also made time to be young, to make mistakes, to fall in love, to stay up too late playing video games, to be deliciously, wonderfully ordinary sometimes. He got his commercial pilot's license at 21. At 23, he was hired by the same airline where it had all started, now completely transformed by the reforms his courage had sparked. His first day in uniform, Helen met him at the airport. She was about to retire after 30 years of flying, and she'd arranged to be his supervising captain on his first official flight. They walked through the terminal together, two black pilots in uniform, and Elijah noticed the way passengers looked at them. With respect, with admiration, with none of the doubt or dismissal that had once been so common. On the plane, preparing for departure, Helen turned to him. "You did this," she said quietly. "You made it possible for us to walk through that airport without people assuming we're lost or asking to see a supervisor. You changed the culture." "We did it," Elijah corrected. "All of us together." The flight was perfect. Smooth takeoff, clear skies, textbook landing. When they touched down, the passengers applauded. Not because they knew who Elijah was, but simply because it had been a good flight. That night, Elijah called his mother. "How was it?" Sarah asked. "Perfect, Mama. Absolutely perfect. I'm so proud of you. I know. I love you. I love you too, baby. Always." Elijah hung up and sat in his small apartment, looking at the newest notebook on his desk. He still documented things, still noticed patterns, still recorded injustices, still spoke up when necessary. But he also documented joy now, beautiful sunsets, kind interactions, moments of unexpected grace. Because he'd learned that documentation wasn't just about capturing what was wrong. It was also about preserving what was right, what was good, what was worth protecting. He picked up his pen and began to write. "Today, I flew for the first time as a commercial pilot. The flight was smooth, the passengers were kind, and no one treated me differently because of the color of my skin. This seems small, but it's everything. Because 13 years ago, when I was 8 years old, this wouldn't have been possible. Not because I wasn't capable, but because the systems weren't ready. The culture wasn't ready. And I documented that. I stood up, I spoke truth, and slowly and possibly, things changed. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough that today I gotta fly. And that's everything. He closed a notebook and smiled. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't in the fighting. It's in the living, the thriving, the flying. It's in becoming the future that once seemed impossible. And in knowing that your courage, however small it felt at the time, helped make that future real. Years later, when Elijah was 35 and a captain himself, he was assigned a flight from Seattle to Atlanta. The route was familiar. The aircraft was the same model. And as he walked through the cabin doing his pre-flight check, he paused at row 32, the seats where he and his mother had sat all those years ago. A young black mother was settling into 32B, helping her son, maybe 7 or 8 years old, buckle his seatbelt. The boy looked up at Elijah in his captain's uniform, eyes wide. "You're the pilot?" the boy asked. "I am," Elijah said warmly. "That's so cool," the boy breathed. Elijah knelt down to the boy's level, the same way Helen had once knelt to his. "You know what the best part about flying is?" Elijah asked. "What?" "It reminds us that impossible things are only impossible until someone has the courage to try them." He glanced at the mother, saw tears forming in her eyes, saw recognition dawn. "You," she started. "Yes," Elijah said quietly. "Many years ago. Same route, same row." "I know your story," she whispered. "I've told my son about you." Elijah looked at the boy again. "What's your name?" "Marcus." The boy said, "Well, Marcus, I'm going to make sure you have the best flight of your life." Okay. Elijah stood, touched the mother's shoulder gently, and continued his check. The flight was perfect. And when they landed in Atlanta, Elijah came back to row 32 one more time. He handed Marcus a small pair of pilot wings, the kind they gave to kids. "Keep these," Elijah said. "And remember, your voice matters. Your observations matter. Your courage matters. Even when you're small. Especially when you're small." Marcus held the wings like they were made of gold. And Elijah walked off that plane knowing that the cycle continued. That courage inspired courage. That documentation inspired documentation. That one person standing up gave others permission to stand up too. And that sometimes the most powerful legacy wasn't in what you accomplished. It was in who you inspired to accomplish things you'd never even imagined. The story of Elijah Montgomery didn't end on that flight when he was 8 years old. It didn't end when Monica was fired, or when policies changed, or when he became a pilot. It continues still in every person who decides to document injustice instead of accepting it, in every child who learns that their voice has power, in every parent who teaches their children to stand up for what's right, even when it's scary, in every system that changes because someone refused to let it stay broken. Elijah's blue notebook sits in a museum, but its legacy lives in countless other notebooks, in phone recordings, in detailed accounts that people now feel empowered to create. Because one 8-year-old boy proved that documentation is resistance. That observation is power. That speaking truth can move mountains, even when the person speaking is barely tall enough to reach the counter. Sarah still works as a nurse, still documents everything, still fights for better care for her patients. Dorothy lived in 93, long enough to see her great-grandchildren, long enough to know that the legacy of courage she'd helped build would continue long after she was gone. Helen retired from flying and devoted herself full-time to the mentorship program that now serves thousands of young people across the country, creating pipelines into aviation careers that once seemed impossible. And Elijah flies. He flies routes across the country and around the world, carrying passengers safely from one destination to another. But he also carries something else, the knowledge that dignity doesn't need permission to exist, that justice delayed is not justice denied if people refuse to stop fighting for it, that the smallest voices, armed with truth and courage, can reshape entire industries, entire cultures, entire ways of seeing the world. On his 45th birthday, Elijah received a letter from a young girl in Japan. She'd watched the documentary about his story. She'd been experiencing discrimination at her school, and inspired by his example, she'd started documenting it. Her careful records had led to a teacher being retrained, policies being revised, and a culture shift in how students from minority background were treated. "Thank you for showing me that I didn't have to accept it," she wrote. "Thank you for teaching me that my observations mattered. Thank you for being brave when you were small, so I could be brave too." Elijah read the letter twice, then filed it carefully in a box where he kept others like it. Hundreds of letters, thousands over the years. Each one a ripple from that original moment of courage. Each one proof that speaking up matters. That documentation matters. That refusing to let injustice disappear into silence changes the world. One voice, one notebook, one flight at a time. And when Elijah flies now, he sometimes thinks about that 8-year-old boy with a blue notebook, sitting in row 32, watching his mother be humiliated and making a choice. Not to accept it, not to stay quiet, not to let it disappear, but to document it, to speak up, to believe that his voice, however small, could matter. That boy changed everything, not through violence, not through hatred, but through courage, clarity, and an unwavering commitment to truth. And in the end, that made all the difference. Because sometimes the greatest power isn't in having all the answers. It's in refusing to stop asking the questions, in documenting what others would rather forget, in speaking truth even when your voice shakes, and in believing, truly believing, that one person, one moment, one act of courage can change the world. Because it can, and it did, and it still does, every single day. If stories like Elijah's remind you why courage matters at any age, subscribe, because the most powerful voices often come from the most unexpected places.